talk to us about the extent of your reporting. You spoke to 17 unnamed sources in this report and what you found.
Sure. Yeah, we talked to, as you say, we cite 17 different sources in the story. Now, these are senior level officials across the government and also senior level individuals inside the affected companies, AWS and Apple. This is a constellation of sources that is robust and it's broad, and it's a pretty comprehensive look at what happened in this attack. And you know what happened here is that the Chinese government, according to our reporting, installed malicious microchips on Supermicro assembled server motherboards. And what a malicious microchip is, think about it as an infection that is hard-coded into your computer. You cannot get rid of it without throwing the machine away. It's a very, very powerful attack. Very few countries would have this capability. And what has really alarmed U.S. officials was that China's control over the manufacture of computer equipment, computer hardware, makes this something that is possible.
Steve, you've had a lot of oversight over the supply chain over the years. What do you make of this?
So one of the things that we recognize is a hardware-based implant would be one of the most powerful ways for a nation state to spy on a data center infrastructure. What's ultimately required is there's a chain of trust. So applications need to trust the underlying operating system or cloud software, and then that software has to trust the underlying hardware. So if you're able to tamper with the hardware, you're essentially able to have access to all of the other things that sit on top of it and would provide tremendous insight and data to an adversary.
Now, given the seriousness of this, I do want to read the response of the companies in full. Amazon saying it is untrue that AWS knew about a supply chain compromise and issue with malicious chips or hardware modifications when acquiring Elemental. This is the company, Jordan, that you report was basically the source of these chips. Apple saying, on this we can be very clear, Apple has never found malicious chips, hardware manipulations, or vulnerabilities purposely planted in any server. And Supermicro saying, we remain unaware of any such investigation. Meantime, you have the Chinese government not directly addressing questions about manipulation of Supermicro servers, issuing a statement that read in part, supply chain safety in cyberspace is an issue of common concern. China is also a victim. Jordan, what is your response to these companies pushing back so hard?
Sure. Yeah. Our response to it is actually that the story speaks for itself. The constellation of sources that we've gathered for this story, again, encompasses senior level officials across the government, including senior individuals inside both named affected companies. I can't speculate. It's not my position to speculate on why these companies might deny these allegations. And I also wanted to clarify a comment I made earlier on Bloomberg Television, where I did speculate on why these companies might deny this reporting. That's not really my place. But what I can say is, the sourcing is broad and robust. Multiple levels of corroboration between individuals and companies and the government, and that the story included the company's denials in full, which is our typical policy, for transparency purposes.
Now, the extent of the data that may or may not have been collected is unclear. But Steve, talk to us about how difficult it would be to even determine that, given that this is a hardware hack, not a software hack.
Right. One of the challenges with hardware is they're really what we call black boxes, meaning they perform a very specific function, but the underlying implementation of how they work is often only known by the designer. But what makes this even more challenging in today's world is the way modern semiconductors and platforms are built is there's massive requirements for sub-suppliers to supply many of the underlying technologies. So chip makers license what we call IP blocks, things that could either create a artificial intelligence part of the chip or a graphics part of the chip to do some very specific functions. And even the designer of the chip itself may not have full visibility as to how all of the underlying components work. And what that means is that if there's any sort of weakness in the supply chain, or what I would call the design chain, meaning how those components were designed, it is possible for an adversary to implant logic that would allow this type of spying to occur.
Jordan, what is the U.S. government telling us here? Because you report that there is still an investigation into this issue that is currently open.
The U.S. government's in a very tricky position. When we started reporting this story, we thought for sure there must have been some sort of private alert that went out. There must have been some mechanism for the government to alert people to this attack. And what we discovered was the U.S. government was in a very tricky position, because if they announced the breach, this is that could potentially damage a U.S. company. And also, this is a U.S. company, and that they, this was a problem with no solution. That was what we walked away from, many conversations with individuals which was, what do we tell people if we announce this? What do we say to people? And the answer that I have is Apple and Amazon, according to our reporting, found these chips. You're not supposed to find these chips. They were doing a level of analysis that most companies don't do. So I think in many ways, they could be a model. This approach could be a model for other companies. You have to think of hardware as another way that your data centers could get compromised, and many companies just don't look at it.
Steve, does this story make you think, well, if this happened, what else is out there?
Absolutely. I think one of the things that we're thinking a lot about is what are all of the different ways an adversary could tamper with the supply chain. Even things like intentionally introducing defects into open source software components that would then be implemented into products across the industry. One of the ways to think of this is we're challenged already in cybersecurity by vulnerabilities that were accidentally introduced into products. If there was an adversary whose goal was to intentionally place a vulnerability such that it could be exploited by them for a long period of time before it was ever found out, that would be an extremely effective technique. And I think if we look at this case, the fact that this was focused on a hardware component in the baseboard management controller portion of the hardware, that's really a portion of the hardware that's all about making it easier to support machines that are in data centers, because we know that we can no longer have humans crawling through data centers to do all sorts of repair. And that means that that type of hardware has immense privilege and power. So although we haven't done forensics on this specific case, it is a very plausible type of scenario that we have a lot of concern about.
Jordan, we heard the vice president shaking aim at China in a speech earlier. We've also are in the middle of a trade war between the United States and China. What do you expect the fallout from this is going to be? I mean, the question really is, what now?
It's hard to know. As we note in the story, our original information, our original tip about this came, when the Obama administration was still in power. And, what that signals to me is that both administrations were deeply concerned, about the security of the supply chain and China. And, it's hard to tell it's impossible to predict what the administration will do. But what I will say is this, is that, one of the lessons that we took away from this reporting very strongly was you're not going to find hardware problems and hardware manipulations if you're not looking for them. Amazon and Apple, again, were looking for these things, and they found them. The vast majority of companies wouldn't. So would it make sense to take all manufacturing of motherboards back to the U.S.? I think a more practical approach for most companies is going to be implementing some form of hardware analysis and hardware inspection as part of their normal security practices.